But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Today we're looking at the letter Vincent wrote to his brother Theo from Orvez, who was on Tuesday, 17 June 1890, so 130 years ago today. Just a friendly warning or a friendly heads up. In about 10 days or so, or basically at the end of June, the kind of honeymoon period, the time where things are going well for the Van Goghs sort of takes a turn. So I'm just giving you guys notice that, you know, all the sort of happiness and joy and everything's going fine in June kind of twist slightly in July. So if it's seeming almost boring that everything's going so well, bear in mind that that is about to end, and obviously at the end of July Vincent loses his life. So we're really now down into the last 2 weeks of sort of the last sort of happy days, I guess, of the great artist Vincent van Gogh. So we're going to go through his letter to Theo. He writes, "My dear Theo, thanks much for your letter of the day before yesterday and for the 50-franc note it contained. I waited for the consignment of colours and canvas from Tassay, which has just arrived, and for which I also thank you very much. To answer the question regarding the difference between Tanguy and Tassay colours, well, it's absolutely the same thing. In the Tassay tubes, there are some from time to time, especially for the white, that aren't filled properly. However, when Tanguy, for his part, also fills them badly too, certainly without doing so deliberately. The tubes of cobalt, for example, like the one I have in my hands. So I'm talking only based on the same fact that exists on both sides. I just don't see why one would have any serious things to reproach the other with. Is there a difference in the invoices? That's what would interest me more. And then in the colours there is adulteration as in wines. How can one judge correctly when, like myself, one knows nothing of chemistry? I'd nevertheless consider it very good that should Père Tanguy be going to extraordinary lengths for us by putting his time and his effort into packaging and dispatching the canvases that are in his attic, then you should get pain from him, even if it's a little worse than the other. It would only be fair." He goes on to write, but what he says about a difference in the tubes, I repeat, it's pure imagination on his part. And the reason why we went to Tassay's is that the latter's colours are in general less insipid. Now this difference isn't important, and if Tanguy has the goodwill to pack up the canvases stored at his place, fair that he has the order for the colours. So this whole first section of the letter is basically the first half of the letter. All has to do with a little bit of discord between two art suppliers. When you talk about art suppliers, we're talking about they supply the materials like colors and canvases and maybe paintbrushes and things like that. And these two are almost competing for the business of Vincent van Gogh. And one of them, I could be wrong, but I think it's Tassay, has sort of accused Tanguy of sort of shortchanging, and Theo has asked Vincent about it. He said, well, what do you say? And if you have any doubts about Van Gogh's sanity or his reasonableness or his sharp mind or his acuity, this is such a great example. He's basically saying, look, and he's so fair, he's so reasonable. He basically says, look, we are getting we are giving these guys a lot of work. Obviously, they're getting a lot of business as well, but they're going to a lot of effort for us. And he's saying to be fair, or not to be fair, to be realistic. Both of them sometimes send through tubes of paint that are not necessarily absolutely full. And one of the art suppliers, I think it's Tassé, has accused Tanguy of doing that intentionally. So it's kind of saying, don't do business with Tanguy. He's a shyster. He's he's doing it on purpose. He's trying to make money out of you or something. And Van Gogh's saying, well, actually, neither of the suppliers are really perfect. And then he says, I think he said the reason they went to Tassé is because there's some of the color from him is a little bit better. But then he says they are getting quite a lot of what's the word? Tanguy's doing them the favor of packing and dispatching canvases that are in his attic. And he talks about going to extraordinary lengths for us. So Van Gogh is kind of saying, I don't think the one is better than the other. Let's continue using them both. I don't think the one accusing the other is necessarily valid. Let's try and keep the train on track. Let's try and keep the show on the road, kind of thing. I just think he's being very fair. Of course, it's in his interest to keep the show on the road as well, but he's certainly not causing. He's not stirring. He's not causing any resentment. He's not inflaming things. He's not making matters worse. If anything, he's de-escalating this little issue, and he's sort of. I just think he's sort of quite reasonable. He's not being sort of resentful or taking sides. He's quite neutral, if that makes sense. And I just think it shows that Van Gogh is quite a fair-minded fellow. The other thing that I might as well bring up, I'd really rather not, but I think we have to at this point, is the explanation for why Van Gogh committed suicide. And we're not there yet in the chronology, but I want to put this idea in your mind just so that you're aware of it, is that because Theo had a little child, he couldn't afford Van Gogh anymore, if that makes sense. He couldn't afford his brothers, the expenses anymore, right? So Theo's in a situation where his family's growing, he's got the demands of the family, and his brothers now come out of the asylum, and Theo finds, wow, I just can't maintain my brother, I can't look after him anymore. And then Vincent realizes this, and then he thinks, wow, I'm such a burden to you, I'm going to kill myself, and that way I won't be a burden to you anymore. That is kind of the mainstream version of why Van Gogh killed himself. So in other words, he killed himself sort of to do his brother a favor. He killed himself because he felt he was a big burden. Now, I'm not going to say there's no validity to that, because there is some. I'm not going to say that it's irrelevant or it's got no historical relevance. It's not an absolutely ridiculous assertion, but if you see it in context, and that's why I'm giving you an early heads up, if you see it in context and you look at the bulk of letters, most of the letters that are exchanged, you don't ever hear Theo saying, jeepers, dude, that is going to be really expensive. I don't think I'm going to be able to help you out. He just doesn't do it. if anything, Van Gogh is constantly assuring his brother that he's not going to be more, there's not going to be more expenses than there needs to be. This is the part that I think is either ignorance from the part of the mainstream, or it's mischievous in that they assuming us to be ignorant, the public and historians and scholars. And that is, this wasn't a situation where Theo, out of the goodness of his heart, was sort of looking after his older brother, giving him handouts out of his own pocket. Now, I've mentioned this earlier. You're only going to know this if you've really researched Van Gogh fairly thoroughly. Van Gogh's allowance, this money that his brother was giving him, was actually part of his total inheritance, right? So it wasn't actually even Theo's money. Theo had custody over it. Theo was sort of the guardian, or the I know there's a better word for it, curator or something, but he was basically he was put in charge of his brother's inheritance from his father of that estate. So all he was doing was just giving regular allotments to his brother of his own money that would otherwise be his. And I've mentioned earlier the reason why Vincent didn't just get the money was because Vincent couldn't really be trusted with it. He would blow it all on women and alcohol and whatnot. And Vincent himself seemed to know this. And I know somebody quite close to me who has an ex-husband who's in exactly the same situation, where she's no longer even married to him, but she gets his money, and she gives him his money in specific amounts, and the reason is because he's legally not allowed to get his own money in how can I put it? He can't withdraw all of it in one go. He's only allowed to receive the allowance through a intermediary, which is in this case his ex-wife, who's a very good, kind person, and whenever he needs something, she does come to his aid. So you do have situations like that. The alcoholics, gamblers, and so on, who are put in the care of the court, and someone is, elected to look after their interests. It also happens with minors when their parents die, at an age where the minor can't look after their own interests. In fact, it happened in the Henry van Breda case, where his sister stood to inherit a fortune, but obviously she can't be given that full amount because she wouldn't. It's just not a situation where that's very advisable, if you get my meaning. Now, what I want you to think about, especially in the letters between now and the end of the month, I want you to think about these letters where Vincent asks for art supplies, as he has for years now, and basically whenever he asks for something, his brother sends it. There's never a problem. There's never an argument. His brother never says you demanding too much. He never says, "Cheapers, are you asking me again for that?" It's simply a case that Vincent says, "I need this and this and this," and his brother sends it. Vincent says, "I need so much money to get my furniture. I need so much money for my accommodation. I need so much money for a suit," and his brother sends it. So it's never a case that Theo kind of stops him and says, whoa, I can't do this. Right? So there's absolutely no enmity. There's no bickering about money. But there is going to be a letter that is about it. Not a series of letters, like one, maybe two letters about it. And that's the difference. If it was a big issue, it would be something that gets worse and worse and worse, as you can imagine in a divorce, where couples sort of, argue about money or whatever. it needs to be like a big conflagration. Anyway, so the thing I want to put into your mind is this thing of the mainstream version for why Van Gogh committed suicide is he felt like his brother couldn't afford to look after him anymore. He was going to be a burden to his family, and so out of consideration to them, he killed himself. Now, to ordinary people, and maybe certain museum scholars even, that might be such a brilliant explanation. Yes, no, it makes complete sense. It's anchored in reality. What they don't seem to think is, practically, if you think about the practical situation of a suicide, is you kill yourself. Now who's going to bury you? Who's going to have to pay for your funeral? Who's going to do all that? And then you say, oh, no, but at least it's not going to be a burden to anyone else. Really? You think killing yourself is not going to make yourself a burden to somebody else? So it's just schizophrenic thinking from the art community as far as I'm concerned. And all of this brings about this this conflict between, so if this version of suicide isn't accurate, which I don't think it is in many, many ways, what really happened? And that is what True Crime Rocket Science addresses and answers, and we're still going to get to that. I just want to set it up for you so that you can see exactly how absurd the mainstream thing is. And this is not a small deal. That letter that we mentioned earlier, co-written between Gogh and Van Gogh, has just sold for $237,000. So, Van Gogh's story is well known, is also worth a lot. But how much of it is actually true? And don't we owe it to ourselves to know the truth about well-known things and beloved people? If we don't know the truth about well-known things, how are we going to know the truth about things that are less well-known? So to continue with his letter, he goes on to say, "It was with pleasure that I made the acquaintance of the Dutchman who came yesterday." Now, he's referring to another painter, Anton Herschig, who was effectively going to be not quite Van Gogh's roommate, but certainly kind of the guy living next door in the Revue Inn. So he was living in the cramped sort of quarters right next door to where Van Gogh was staying. This is also a lesser known fact of Van Gogh is, in this period where he's supposedly suicidal, he actually has another painter come stay there with the whole idea to build this kind of artist studio. That is what this is all about. It was not just Van Gogh on his own trying to sell his work. It was trying to develop a studio, and the other brother, Theo, would then be the sort of exclusive market agent of the studio. Does that make sense? Again, you've got to think, how could someone be suicidal or thinking of killing themselves when they're in like a building phase, when they're thinking about the future, when they're expanding what they want, when they're ordering supplies, when they're talking about projects and business relationships and all that kind of thing? There's no self-pity, there's no despair, there's no pitiful complaining against somebody else. Even this sort of thing between the two art suppliers, if anything, Van Gogh is grateful and reasonable rather than petty and petulant. Anyway, he goes on to say, he looks much too nice to be doing painting in the current conditions, which I think is kind of a funny way of saying it. I think what he's saying is, wow, what a nice young guy. Does he realize what he's in for? Does he realize what is in store for him in terms of, when he talks about the current conditions, he's saying how difficult it is to sell art, how difficult it is to make a living. And he's kind of like looking at this guy saying, wow, what a nice guy. Wow, you are in for a bit of a shitstorm kind of thing. And of course he was. He had no idea that, you know, the dude next door would be dead within 6 weeks. And what's also interesting is we've got also the testimony of Anton Herschig talking about what he saw and heard around those circumstances, and we'll get to that. He goes on to say, if he nevertheless persists in wanting to do it, I told him that he would do well to go to Brittany with Gogh and de Haan, because he'll live there on 3 francs a day instead of 5 francs, and will have good company. So, again, quite self-deprecating from Van Gogh. He kind of says to Herschig, dude, if you really want to make a living, you should probably go to Brittany, hang out with Gogh, and you'll be able to survive on, you know, even less money than here, and you'll be in good company. So it's quite interesting that Van Gogh is almost sending away a companion, or thinking of that at any rate. But what he's really doing is he's just thinking of the best interests of this young artist. Then he says, and it's not as though he's being nasty, he kind of says that I myself also hope very much to join them. So he's kind of saying to this young guy, you know what, you should really go and join these other 2 guys. You can live cheaper and you can have a good company. Now, what's he talking about when he says good company? Well, if you think about the letter that was co-written by Gauguin and Van Gogh that's just sold, it's all about visiting brothels, making art, making love, getting drunk. That was the artist's life. I mean, shouldn't artist life be all about work, all work, no play, no sales, and misery? Van Gogh didn't think so. But Van Gogh's kind of in a good boy phase. He's trying to get his art back on track. He's trying to keep the mischievous side of his life off the agenda, and he's trying to just, you know, get back on the horse kind of thing. And he's obviously also aware he can't just go to Gogh and de Haan and go to Madagascar, because he's worried about his health. He's still kind of it's almost like he's in a trial phase. You know, he's just trying to get through this trial period without an incident. And the 17th of June basically marks almost a month since he's left Saint-Germain, and nothing has happened. He's just back to work, isn't he? And again, if you listen to his letters, there's no problems whatsoever. There's no health issues. There's no incidents. There's nothing. And he does talk about, I myself also hope very much to join them since Gogh is going there. I was really pleased to learn that they're going to renew their attempt there, meaning the tropics. Certainly you're right that it's better for Gogh than staying in Paris. Very pleased too that he likes the head of that Arlésienne. I really hope to do a few etchings of subjects from the south, let's say 6, since I can print them free of charge at Mr. Gachet's. He's very willing to run them off for nothing if I do them. It's certainly a thing that must be done, and will act in such a way that in some way it forms a sequel to the Lorze Monticelli publication, if you approve. And Gogh will probably engrave a few of his canvases in combination with me. His paintings, which belongs to you, his painting, which belongs to you, and especially the rest of the Martinique things, which plates Mr. Gachet will also print off for us. Of course, we'll leave him free to run off copies for himself. Mr. Gachet will come one day to see my canvases in Paris, and then we choose the ones to be engraved. At the moment, I have 2 studies on the go. Okay, so what I think is really worth emphasizing at this point is that in almost every letter Vincent writes, and actually Theo as well, Dr. Gachet is mentioned. And you'll notice Dr. Gachet isn't really mentioned as a doctor. He's often referred to as Mr. Gachet. And he's also not really mentioned as treating Vincent in one way or the other. It's all to do with art. And in this particular reference, he's kind of saying how Dr. Gachet sort of said, yeah, no, you can print as many of your artworks, using my, services or resources or whatever. That's fine. And then Van Gogh kind of sort of generously says he can print as many copies for himself. In other words, almost as if he can find a way to sell them, then he can make money off, Van Gogh's sort of efforts. And this is going to be a very important aspect when we talk about motive at the end of July. This whole thing of, I don't want to call it mixing business with pleasure, but mixing, in Dr. Gachet's, from Dr. Gachet's perspective, it is mixing business with pleasure, because Dr. Gachet's business is medicine and health. His pleasure is art. And with Van Gogh, he's kind of mixing business with pleasure. With Van Gogh, it's mixing business with business, or business with his doctor, I guess. But the whole thing is, his doctor now has a kind of a vested interest in Van Gogh's art. Does that make sense? And if you think about it, the exact same situation played out in the Yellow House in Arles, where Gogh, we'll put it this way, Vincent had a vested interest in Gogh because of Gauguin's relationship with Theo, in terms of, selling. They were trying to set up a studio and set things up also for Vincent. And Vincent was trying to sort of get the, almost rub shoulders with Gogh and have some of that magic dust fall on him, because at that point Gogh was a more established artist and a more successful artist. By this time now, his fortunes had sort of fluctuated somewhat, and that was prompting him to want to leave France completely and set up a studio elsewhere. And of course, the emphasis on all these artists was on living cheap. Do you notice that? And then Van Gogh talks about some of the artworks he's working on. He says, at the moment I have 2 studies on the go. One, a bouquet of wild plants, thistles, ears of wheat, leaves of different types of greenery. One almost red, the other very green, and the other yellowing. Now, I must say, Van Gogh has his moments. He has moments where his art is quite exquisite, quite stunning. But then he also has these sort of really average moments where he paints something and it's really neither here nor there. It's really average or even plain. Really uninspiring, very ordinary. Then he talks about the second study, a white house amid greenery, with a star in the night sky and an orange light at the window, and dark greenery and a somber pink note. That's quite an interesting artwork. It reminds slightly of Starry Night, just in terms of that glittering star in the sky scenario. It's not a bad image. It's just, again, kind of quite dull for Orvez. It's sort of, it's someone walking down the road. It could be anywhere, and it's not particularly inspired. And one does wonder, when Vincent was producing these artworks, bear in mind he would paint in plein air, which means outside, outdoors. What did people make of him when they walked by? Did they greet him? Did they talk to him? Did they ask him what he was doing? Or did they sort of turn their nose up at him? Did they ignore him? Did they just sort of walk by? And how did that feel? What was that like? Was there sort of gossip in the town that Van Gogh is the guest of Dr. Gachet and thus kind of a prestigious fellow? Or was the talk, well, there's the guy without the ear? Then Van Gogh goes on to say, that's all for the moment. I have an idea for doing a more important canvas of Daubigny's garden, house and garden, of which I already have a small study. What's quite interesting in his painting of Daubigny's garden, he also paints a cat in the garden, sort of cat running by. Not a great execution though, but what is capturing there is the liveliness of always just the domestic animals running around and just the liveliness of nature in the setting that he's in. He goes on, and that's also just not a terribly good painting that he produced there. He says, I was really pleased that Gauguin is going off with De Haan again. Naturally, this Madagascar plan seems to me hardly possible to carry out. I would much prefer to see him leave for Tonkin. Tonkin is a French, or was a French protectorate in northern Vietnam, a sort of French colony. So that seems to be what Van Gogh's referring to. He goes on to say, if however he went to Madagascar, I'd be able to follow him there, for one should go there in 2s or 3s. But we aren't there yet. So again, this is Van Gogh talking about what he wants to do in future. And obviously in his mind, things weren't that bad with Gauguin that he felt like that they still weren't friends, and that he could, go and join his pal and continue whatever they were doing. And I'm not sure if Gauguin has invited him, but anyway, in Van Gogh's dreams or in his fantasies, he's thinking, wow, I would also like to go to the tropics. I'd also like to go to Madagascar. Madagascar is off the coast of South Africa, and that's, of course, where Cor van Gogh, his brother, also went. So it's quite interesting that Vincent's thinking of following another artist, a guy he really admires, and even though his brother's in South Africa in the same neck of the woods, there's not even a twinkle in his eye, which is quite, I think, ironic. I agree with him where he says one should go there in 2s and 3s. I've lived overseas in different places overseas for a couple of years, and it is nicer when you go in a small little group. You can form your own little enclave, and you feel like you've brought a little bit of home with you, or a little bit of people that, I don't know, what can you call it? You brought a little bit of a little network with you, and that does help you set up shop or whatever in another country. He goes on to say, certainly the future is very much in the tropics for painting, either in Java or in Martinique, Brazil or Australia, and not here. But you feel that it hasn't been proved to me that you, Gauguin, or I, or those people of that future. But certainly, once again, there and not here, one day, probably soon, one will see Impressionists working who will hold their own with Millet, Pissarro. Can you see how he's thinking about art in a big way? He's thinking about it with a sense of purpose, with a sense of mission, with a sense of the future. This isn't a suicidal guy whatsoever. And he goes on to say, believing in that is natural, but going there without the means of existence or a relationship with Paris, a mad impulse when for years on end one has rusted away while vegetating here. Well, thanks again, and good handshake to you and your wife, and good health to the little one, whom I'm really longing to see again. Yours truly, Vincent. And that's the end of the letter. I will be back on the 23rd, that's Tuesday next week, with the next letter, which is from Theo to Vincent, and then the very next day Vincent writes back to Theo on the 24th of June. And then there's a letter from Paul Gauguin to Vincent on the 28th of June, another letter to Theo on the 28th of June, and then we're in the final month of July. So we've got 4 letters to get through, and then it's the end of June. So it's quite sad in a way. Okay, so thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.